Okay, class, with this lecture, we're going to move out of the geometric period and into go through the Orientalizing period and then the Archaic period. Now, a couple things about these periods. First of all, when we got into the Iron Age, with the end of the Bronze Age, around 1000 BC, we talked about the Dark Ages in the last class. And with the advent of metallurgy, with iron metallurgy, we'll see that a lot will change, and I'm going to talk about that as we go on. It'll have great effects on warfare, which will ultimately lead to effects on social structures. I want to point out the periods we're going to be going through for the next few classes. We did the geometric period. We're going to hear the dates for the Orientalizing and Archaic. We'll get down to what's called the transitional period. Now, the transitional period at the end, to a great extent, overlaps with the High Classical, and even at the beginning, sort of overlaps with the Archaic period. Sometimes, depending on the artwork. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Now, these are more recent. These are art historical names that have been applied to these periods. Nobody in Greece walked around saying, "I'm living in the Orientalizing period" or "I'm living in the Archaic period." Right? These are terms that art historians applied much, much later. And the High Classical, as we can see, is by the name, is sort of what these art historians thought were sort of an apex of Greek art, ancient Greek art. And we will spend many, many classes on the 5th century, the 450, well, about 490 to 400 BC. But we'll get to that when we get to that. I want to show the development of artwork through the Orientalizing and Archaic and transitional periods first. And today we're going to do the Orientalizing period and introduce the Archaic period. Now, it is what's brought about the name is the idea of Oriental elements entering into the artwork. That is to say, things like iconography from the Middle East. We will get to that later. I want to show you some other interesting things first. Here's a Chi vase. This is a small vase, actually. And we see registers here. And on the if you look on the left, you see a register of soldiers, and then on the bottom, we'll see cavalrymen. So it's infantry and then cavalry below. Now, a couple things to notice different than the geometric period is that the body is handled much better. It's far more naturalistic than it was that we saw before. We see details on the faces, and they're polychrome, or the figures themselves are polychromatic. So the artist can do a lot more with these vases, especially with these darker colors against the lighter background. And we see that warfare is one concept that's emphasized in the artwork. The boy in the black there is shown playing, on the left, is shown playing a double flute, which we don't have to worry about, but that was sort of an instrument for marching on to war. And then we can see these two clashing infantrymen with their spears drawn, and they're about to attack. Notice that they do have the plumes that will become common, and we're all familiar with the horsehair plumes on their helmets. And these are different than the Bronze Age. Once again, in the Iron Age, they imposed their own plumes of the helmets onto the Bronze Age, but we now know that that's not the case. And I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. Now, here's the thing to point out, is that one of the things that happens with metal is that it causes an arms race. It continues on from the Naue Type 2 idea that I mentioned before. Iron is very cheap, and there's a lot of iron in the Mediterranean, iron ore. The problem is extracting it, and you have to reach even higher pyrotechnical skills than they had to have before in order to extract the iron. But they figured that out in the Iron Age, and this allowed metallurgy to take off a lot more than when you had to have bronze and had to have tin shipped in from very far away, like Afghanistan or England. Now you could get all your materials right at home, and produce warfare like warfare weapons like mad. And one of the things is you can make these large spears, and they can just be mold made, and you could pour the iron into the mold and wait for it to dry, cool rather, polish it off and then go to the next one and mass produce weapons. And this brought weapons down to the common man. And one of the things that would emerge was hoplites. And hoplites are the soldiers of the cities, basically, because the people live in the city-state at this point. The polis, once again, the polis is Greek for city. It was where we get the word politics, etc. And every free landowning man, would could vote. If they were in Athens, they could vote, but were soldiers. Now, this is primarily true in Athens. We'll see things are a bit different in Sparta. But they are able to arm themselves, and we can see that they all have different types of shield decorations on them. And they march in formation, and this is the very famous phalanx. And that's a troop organization you're quite familiar with. That's when troops march in order. They'll march in line and march to orders of steps. March, etc. And it keeps them organized. And it's not singular heroic fighting like we saw in the Bronze Age, but far more organized and aggressive. And as I said, that's why we still see people march to this day. Back then, remember, people would have swords and spears out. So when they said make a left turn or right turn, you had to make that turn. Otherwise, you were going to stab the person in front of you. So these types of discipline in the army came into being, but it also showed that citizens were now part of it, and this would make them active parts in society, as we will see as we go through the next several lectures. Here is what's called the Macmillan Ribolos. This ribolos is simply just a very small vessel that pours out perfume, etc. And here we can see this. This has a lion's face as a mouth. I'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the Near Eastern elements is this yawning, this growling lion that I'm going to come back to. But more importantly, we see once again below that warfare battles, and we see people, attacking, and some people falling. That's in the large register in the middle there, and they have different types of shields. And then on the bottom, we see some sort of horse charge. Probably that is some sort of hunt with little rabbits below. But this idea of the man soldier is becoming quite common, and it's no longer just the hero soldier. Here we see what's called a Proto-Corinthian ope. An ope is just a vessel that, once again, a different shape for pouring. And I just want to point out that on this one we see black figures on a white background. Get used to that term. We're going to call this black figure vase painting, when it's black on white. This will reverse later on, so know this term. What I want to point out is, we just see three registers with different animals, rabbits, and then a lion and deer, and then a deer on top. And then a nice plain white background. Notice, once again, there's the polychromatic depiction of them. It's not just black and the pale color that we saw in the geometric. Also notice that these little seven-starred rosettes that float around. We've seen those before, but they're no longer as prominent as they were before, and we'll see that this desire to fill in this space goes away. Now, here's something I want to introduce to you real quick, and I should have mentioned it in the last slide. The concept of horror vacui. Horror vacui, HORROR space VACUI, means the fear of emptiness, the fear of vacuums. And that's what was happening in the Orientalizing period, or it happens in the geometric period, and it continues in the Orientalizing period, but starts to die out. Now, I want you to pay attention to that because that transition will become really big by the time we get to the Archaic period. Horror vacui. Remember that term, the fear of empty spaces. And that's what we've seen so far in the geometric and Orientalizing. They have to fill up all the spaces. Now, one last one I want to show you is this vessel here. Oh, this is not the last one, but an important vessel I want to show you. It's called a relief amphora. It's a large vessel from the island of Mykonos. It has these crazy handles in it. There's two of them that makes it an amphora, but they're almost solid, and they have little windows in them. And it's called a fenestrated amphora. Fenestrated just means having the handles having windows in them. But I want you to pay attention to the details on the neck and the body. And here we see on the neck a mold impressed design, and it shows a horse with some men climbing out of it and some men already on the outside, sort of looking in. And we can see the windows on the horse, so we know that there's men inside, and we can see that the horse has wheels on its feet, so it's not real. Now, what's going on here is that you would think that, well, first of all, it's obviously the Trojan horse, right? The Troy, that story is going to be an iconographical leitmotif for the rest of the semester. So if there's people, if you want to show the Trojan horse, you have to show that there's people inside, and then everybody knows what you're talking about. The problem is that in real life, a horse with windows would not have worked. So the artist here realizes that, but it's more important to show there's people inside, and that's an artificial horse, and so that's emphasized with the wheels on the bottom. I would just like to point out too that they now have their Trojan helmets that were not really Trojan helmets, were later Trojan helmets, but were associated with that. I talked about this a lot. So in any case, the neck has a relief on it. On the right, we see various things going on here in the registers, some sort of wrestling and battling, etc. And one of them is the battle between the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. Now, you don't have to know this, but Peleus and Thetis were the parents of Achilles, and Achilles is the main character of the Iliad. And as a matter of fact, Thetis shows up several times in the Iliad to talk to Achilles. In any case, it's Achilles' wrath that leads to the story in the Iliad. So that's shown in the middle here, and then how the war ends on the top. And what's really important, and this is a really important concept, is we start to get the iconography to reflect mythology that we're familiar with. So we know we're talking the same language and reading the same message as the ancient Greeks were. Another example of an orientalizing black figure vessel is the Nessos amphora. Now it says proto-Attic, but for our purposes that just means it's an Attic style, but during the Orientalizing period. And what we see here is on top a man killing a centaur, and on the bottom we see Medusas, and we think this is most likely the stories of Perseus here. Notice Medusas are larger on the shoulder. That's more of a main story. Once again, black figure, only a couple spots in between to fill up the spaces, but horror vacui is dying away. What I want you to pay attention to is the posture of the Medusas in the center, with their right knee down and their left knee jutting forward. This is called the Knielauf, and it means a running kneel. And we're going to see this quite a bit. This is also introduced from the Near East as a stance to show running. Here, what's called the Polyphemus painter. We see here this large amphora with fenestrated handles. On the bottom, we see on the body, in the bottom, we see a woman floating around without a head. So this is Medusa here. You can't see on the right side, but she's laying down on the far right of the right side. On the left, there's two women standing there. They have heads. And remember, there are three, the Gorgons, and Medusa gets her head cut off. Now, on the top, what's quite interesting, and where this vessel gets its name, is it shows the killing of Polyphemus and in the Odyssey. And this is the climax of the story of the Odyssey. Well, not the climax. It's the main action scene in the center of the book, and then there's another one at the end. And here it shows Odysseus painted in white, sticking a big stick through the eye of the giant Cyclops Polyphemus, who is seated. Now notice that he is seated, but as seated, he's as tall as the men are standing. So therefore, he's a monster. How does Odysseus trick him so he can blind him? Well, he gets him drunk. And so we can see that Polyphemus is sitting there holding a drinking vessel. And Odysseus waits until he passes out, and then he and his men blind the Cyclops. And so that the Cyclops will stop eating Odysseus' men. And then his men are shown in black, and they have white faces. And this sort of takes us back a little bit towards the geometric, the dealing with the hips and the triangular torso. But the details of the face are quite different and good. And so we get stories here, the stories of the Odyssey, below Perseus. On the shoulder, that might be the Caledonian boar hunt, which you don't have to know. But the interesting thing is that, once again, we're getting references to Homer or other mythology. And these vessels seem to be visual props in the telling of these stories. And we'll talk about that a lot in this class. But I also just want you to pay attention to the nice, interlacing right below the lip or right below the bores on the shoulder there, and the nice color work and the really excellent painting done on this vessel. And the painter's abilities will just get superior over time. Now, I want to introduce one idea real quick, and that's the idea of the didalic style. It's called didalic because it's primarily on Crete, and it's named after Daedalus, who is the architect of Knossos. You can see it best on the right. What makes it didalic is first of all the hair that comes down in sort of long locks or beads, with the very almondine eyes, the triangular face. And the pursed lips, sometimes with a little bit of a smile, but we'll talk more about that in the next period. And you can see that a bit on the left as well, with the figure hanging underneath the lion on the pendant. And this is just a style that is used primarily on Crete, but not completely. This one's from Rhodes. And it harkens back to Minoan styles. Hence it's called, it's a Minoanizing, but Minoans are long gone by this point, right? They were gone by the end, during the end of the Bronze Age. They weren't gone; they just weren't in power. But we see that the artistic iconography continues on. Be able to recognize those faces. Should I show you one on an exam? And we also begin to start getting proper temples. Now, one of the things that's happening is temples were made out of wood, and so those ones are not preserved for us, but they begin to make the transition of being made out of stone, and we're going to see the development of them. And here's a very simple temple that's built during, the Archaic period, and we see, let's look on the slide, the image on the right first. Notice the North era. First things first, all Greek temples face east. That's where the sun rises. They just do. That's all there is to it. This is a very simple temple with the two doorways that take you into the atrium, and then the pronaos, or the room before the naos, the main room. And you walk in, and there's that base there, and that would have held statues of whatever deity was in Prinyas, which is now lost to us. Notice that there's no columns around it. It's just a simple rectangular building, and this will get developed over time. We can see here, this is the frieze at Prignas here. And we can see these two women seated facing each other, and then a relief of lions below them. And as you can see in the upper right, there's yet another relief underneath facing down. Now keep an idea that the long, thinner block on the bottom would have been the cornice, and that would have been going over the it's like the lintel block. It would have been going over right where you walked in. Those lions, once again, represent an Oriental influence. I'll talk about it in a moment. But if you look in the lower left, or lower right rather, you can see the hairstyle and that hat that these Daedalic figures wear. They're completely covered clothing-wise. Women will remain nude a lot longer than men in Greek art. Then there's that splaying bead-like hair and very stiff frontal view of them, or aspect of them. I just want to point out here that here we see these lines on the left from Prignas, and they are striding and then turning to the left out. Now, these lion figures, though we had some references to them in the Bronze Age, really become prominent now, as they were prominent in the Near East. This is the Lamassu creature on the far right. Now, this isn't a lion so much as it's a ram with wings and a human's head. It's a quadruped. But I want you to pay attention to the posture, where it's striding, but then the head turned looking completely out. And the one on the bottom right is very Near Eastern because it's gaping. There are lions at Pyrgos aren't. We'll see in later ones they soon will be. And pay attention to that gaping, yawing mouth, sneering at us, with its nose wrinkled because it's in anger. Also, what we find at Prignas, it's very interesting, is this equestrian procession. This procession on horses. And we're going to see this continue on well up into the Parthenon and later. The horses are quite large. I remember thinking that there was some sort of, they were just being, the measurements were not, right, and the artist was getting things wrong. But I taught this class with Phil Dragula for a while, and his wife is really into horses. And he says, no, war horses are actually quite large. The horses we're used to see, ponies and other, and straight out, horses, are smaller, so we can ride them. But if you wanted a war horse, you got a big horse. And so this is not unlikely. And notice they have their shields and their spears. They're duplicated over and over in a sort of staccato depiction. They're all the same. But in any case, we see an equestrian warfare-like procession associated with the temple. And so we get these motifs that are going to continue on in Greek temples. Now let's talk specifically about some details of Greek temples. First of all, the Greek ones have their big platform, three-step platform, onto which is built a rectangular temple. These have three types. These have columns that hold out the ends of the roof. I'll talk about the columns later. When you go in, there'd be yet another room on the inside, the naos or the cella. And the naos would be where the statue of the god or goddess is held. By the way, I forgot to point out on these circular outside columns, this is called a peristyle construction. They would have terracotta roofs, most often, not always though. And I want you to pay attention to the right where it says the entablature. Now, the entablature is going to be important for distinctions of types of temples. I'll come back to that. And then above the entablature is the pediment, that triangular area, and that's important for sculptures as well. And we'll talk about pedimental sculptures and frieze sculptures. Those are ones in the entablature, frieze relief sculptures. So those are the two most important things. Now, there are three types of Greek temple orders that you need to know. And should I show you a temple on the exam, you have to be able to say whether it's Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian. Now, first things first. On the Doric here, notice, by the way, that it's made out of column drums, not one specific stone, or not one monolithic stone. That's just to show you the different types of constructions. That isn't only with Doric, but it's more common with Doric. And the Doric is the oldest style. We look at the bottom, there's no base to the column. Now, the indentations that go up the sides are called fluting, okay, F-L-U-T-I-N-G. Then it goes up to the capital, which is number 3 on the Doric one, and we can see it's a plain capital. It's called a pillow capital, just because that's the shape of it. It's very simple, but that's very Doric. And then when we get up to the entablature, the bottom part, number 5 there, is the architrave, and then 6 is the frieze. And we're going to see lots of artwork from the frieze, from different temples. Now, in the Doric, and this is extraordinarily important that you know, because we'll see it on the Parthenon, there's 2 types of squares or rectangular depictions on the frieze. The one is just 3 lines going up and down, and that is 6B here. And that's called a triglyph. And then on to the next one, the 6A, is called a metope, M-E-T-O-P-E. And this is where they'll show figures in relief and show the artwork. The important thing to keep in mind is it's not a continuous frieze, as we will see on the Ionic or Corinthian. And then above that is the triangular pediment, which we'll talk a lot more about as we go on. The Ionic does have a base. It has the fluting that goes up. Fluting is a little bit different, but that's too deep in the weeds for us. But then the capital, and this is what you use to tell the orders apart. The capital looks like a papyrus scroll turned upside down and looked from the side. And those round things are called volutes. And you go up to the frieze, and there are no metopes or triglyphs. It's a continuous frieze. Pay attention to that. That's going to be important when we get to the Parthenon. And then finally, we get the third style called the Corinthian, which will become really popular with the Romans. It's the latest chronologically. And it's like the Ionic, except the capital has a whole bunch of leaves on it. It's called acanthus leaves, A-C-A-N-T-H-U-S. And this is just a style that originated in Corinth. Doric was a style that originated in northern Greece. Ionic in Ionia, which is now western Turkey. So these are the 3 major styles. They will get mixed and they will get developed, and the Romans will change them a bit. So pay attention to these styles. Just to emphasize a couple more ideas here. We can see on the bottom the stereobates and stylobates of the foundation. Not worried about that. Pay attention to the base and the capital of the columns. Those will tell us what order it is. And then the artwork in the frieze, and then the artwork in the pediment. Those are the 2 places where we're going to see our most artwork on these temples. This slide shows the pediment as part of the entablature. The last one didn't. I'm not too concerned about that. But no pediment versus frieze. Now, early on, when they start building the temples out of stone, they will use several rows of columns on the outside of the cella or naos, and then more in the interior. Because first of all, remember these guys were copied from the Egyptians. I should show you an Egyptian slide here now, but the Egyptians, their buildings were massive, and they needed a whole bunch of stone columns to hold up these heavy stone ceilings, and I mean massive. And we get that idea of this reconstruction on the right. If you look in the center hallway between the 2 columns, it shows 2 little people. Now this is not in Africa, but it gives you an idea of how large these temples could get. And if they were that big and had such a big roof, you needed a whole bunch of columns to hold it up. This will decrease over time, and these will change. These styles will change, and we'll quickly see, that they will lose this multiple rows of columns in the peristyle and get down to just one row of columns. I just want to show you. I mean, what the ancients did for these columns is pretty amazing. This is a place called Ketistos, and it's an island to the east of Athens, and where there was a stone quarry way up in the hillside. This is a Roman stone quarry, or column quarry, I should say. And what they liked about it was that they could get monolithic columns out of it. And they had a nice grain to them, so they would look good. And there was actually chutes where they could slide these columns all the way down without getting broken, and get them onto those boats, many miles away in the harbor there, and, without being broken as their desire. Why these ones were left behind, I don't know. But just to give you an idea of just how important these things would become. Okay, and we'll continue with temples in the next lecture.